Picture this: towering stone walls that seem to touch the sky, arched cloisters where the only sounds are the soft shuffle of sandals and the distant murmur of prayer. From the outside, medieval monasteries appeared as islands of perfect peace, havens where men and women devoted their lives to God, far from the chaos and temptations of the world. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, embracing silence as a sacred pathway to inner purity. But if you listen closely to the echoes of history, you'll discover that behind those solemn facades, human nature refused to be tamed. What really went on behind those heavy wooden doors and latticed windows was anything but quiet surrender. We often imagine monasteries as places frozen in time, where every day followed the same rhythm of prayer and work, and where spiritual devotion left no room for earthly struggles. But the truth is far more fascinating and far more human. These communities were microcosms of the society they sought to escape, complete with power struggles, secret ambitions, whispered romances, and even acts of rebellion. Think about it: put hundreds of people together in an isolated environment, impose strict rules on every aspect of their lives, add wealth, influence, and the constant tension between sacred ideals and human weakness, and you have a recipe for drama that rivals any modern-day series. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on the hidden world of medieval monasteries and silent orders. We'll explore tales of abbots who ruled like kings, monks who challenged church doctrine, nuns who defied expectations, and the everyday tensions that turned quiet corridors into stages for intrigue and passion. These stories aren't just relics of the past, they speak to timeless themes of power, faith, loyalty, and the struggle between our highest ideals and our most human instincts. So come with us on a journey into the shadows of history, where silence was never truly silent, and where the quest for salvation often unfolded with all the complexity, conflict, and richness of life itself. But to truly grasp the intensity of the hidden dramas that unfolded within monastery walls, we have to travel back to the very beginning, to the origins of the monastic ideal itself. It all started not in the lush green valleys of Europe, but in the harsh, sun-scorched deserts of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries. These were the Desert Fathers, men like Saint Anthony the Great, who made a radical and stunning decision. They believed that the best way to seek God was to turn their backs completely on Roman society, which they saw as steeped in materialism, corruption, and spiritual emptiness. They fled to the solitude of the desert, living in caves or simple huts, dedicating their lives to prayer, fasting, and fierce spiritual combat against temptation. This was the birth of Christian monasticism, a movement founded on utter rejection of the world. This powerful idea of withdrawal didn't stay in the desert for long. It spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean and into Europe, capturing the imagination of countless men and women seeking a more meaningful, austere spiritual path. But as more people joined, the solitary life of a hermit became impractical. Communities began to form, and with them came the need for rules, a framework to structure this new way of life. This is where figures like Saint Benedict of Nursia stepped onto the stage in the 6th century. His rule, the Benedictine Code, became the bedrock for Western monasticism. It was a document of profound wisdom and balance, built on the 3 core vows: poverty, meaning you owned nothing personally; chastity, meaning you renounced all physical relationships; and obedience, meaning you surrendered your will completely to the abbot and the rule of the community. The rule organized the entire day into a sacred rhythm known as the Horarium, a cycle of communal prayer, manual labor, and sacred reading. This balance was key. Prayer elevated the soul, labor sustained the body and the community, and study enriched the mind. It was meant to create a self-sufficient, spiritually focused world entirely separate from the sin and distraction of everyday life. On paper, it was a blueprint for a perfect, harmonious society dedicated to God. But this is where our first great contradiction emerges, the seed from which so much future drama would grow. These rules, designed to eliminate worldly conflict by removing personal property, ambition, and desire, actually created a pressurized environment where human nature was tested to its absolute limits. How could you vow to own nothing when the entire community was growing rich? How could you vow perfect obedience to an abbot who might be greedy or incompetent? The ideal was celestial, but the people were heartbreakingly human. And then came the wealth. What started as communities of humble ascetics slowly transformed into some of the most powerful economic and political institutions in medieval Europe. Why? Because of pious donations. A nobleman hoping to save his soul might bequeath vast swaths of land to a local monastery. A king seeking divine favor for a battle would gift them treasures and estates. Over centuries, monasteries became major landowners, operating massive farms, vineyards, and workshops. They were centers of industry, innovation, and finance. The very poverty they vowed became invisible under the weight of golden chalices, ornate manuscripts, and sprawling complexes that rivaled royal palaces. This created an impossible tension. You had monks and nuns who had personally vowed to own nothing, living and working within an institution that owned everything. This gap between spiritual ideal and earthly reality became a chasm. And it was across this chasm that whispers of hypocrisy, resentment, and ambition began to echo. The stage was now perfectly set for the human drama to begin. Yet for all its spiritual intention, this profound silence was far from absolute. It was a carefully managed tool, not an unbreakable law, and human ingenuity found countless ways to work within and around its constraints. The vow of silence, particularly in strict orders like the Carthusians or Cistercians, did not mean a complete absence of communication. Instead, it created a fascinating and complex shadow language. Monastic communities developed elaborate systems of hand signals for necessary daily interactions. A specific gesture might request more bread at the meal. Another might indicate a need for a specific tool in the scriptorium, and yet another could signal that a brother was needed in the infirmary. This signed language was a practical solution, but it also became a conduit for expression far beyond its simple vocabulary. A subtle shift in a gesture, a prolonged glance held a moment too long, or an eyebrow raised in a particular way could convey annoyance, solidarity, humor, or warning. What was meant to be a purely functional system became imbued with unspoken emotional subtext. The most dramatic breaches of silence, however, happened in the hidden corners of the monastery, the shadowy cloister walk after compline, the dimly lit storage cellar, or behind the massive cover of a choir stall during a long service. Here, in stolen moments, whispered conversations would occur. These weren't trivial chats. The very risk involved made the content potent. A novice might confess his doubts to a trusted elder. A group of disgruntled monks might quietly plot to challenge an abbot's unpopular decision, or news from the outside world would be passed along in hushed tones. The content of these whispers was amplified by their secrecy, turning minor grievances into serious conspiracies and simple gossip into cherished secrets. The written word also became a powerful tool for subterfuge. Small, hastily written notes on scraps of parchment could be slipped into a book, passed during the handoff of a tool or left in a pre-arranged hiding spot. These messages carried the weight of forbidden communication, whether they contained a critique of a superior, a verse of poetry, or a simple expression of friendship. This environment turned the entire monastery into a stage for a silent, continuous drama. Every interaction, no matter how small, was subject to interpretation. A monk who averted his eyes during a reading might be seen as guilty, while one who was too free with his approved gestures might be viewed as insolent. The constant self-policing and observation by others created an atmosphere of pervasive tension beneath the calm surface. The vow of silence, intended to strip away the distractions of the world and the ego, ironically created a hyper-focused social environment where every slight gesture and minute expression was loaded with meaning. It amplified the very human interactions it sought to eliminate, forcing them into a subtler and often more intense form. The silence didn't kill the drama, it simply made the actors more cunning and the plot more intricate. At the very heart of every monastic community sat the abbot, a figure whose authority was meant to be both paternal and absolute. Chosen to lead, he was not just a spiritual guide but the CEO of a complex and often wealthy corporation. His word was law, governing everything from the interpretation of scripture to the management of vast estates, the distribution of food, and the assignment of punishments. He held the keys to the treasury and the souls of his monks. This concentration of power, intended to create order and unity, instead became the single greatest source of conflict within the cloister. The struggle for this position and the constant challenge to maintain it reveals that the quest for influence is a profoundly human urge, one not easily surrendered at the monastery gate. The election of an abbot was a moment of high tension and high stakes, a political event disguised as a spiritual exercise. While the process varied, it often involved the entire community of choir monks, and the campaigning could be intense long before the formal vote. Factions would naturally form, backing different candidates who represented competing visions for the monastery's future. One group might champion a stern, reform-minded traditionalist who promised a return to strict austerity and prayer. Another might throw its support behind a more worldly, politically connected figure who could leverage relationships with local nobles and bishops to protect the monastery's lands and privileges. These weren't mere differences of opinion, they were battles for the very soul and survival of the institution. The aftermath of a contested election could leave deep, festering wounds, with the losing faction feeling resentful and marginalized, waiting for an opportunity to challenge the new abbot's authority. Once in power, an abbot's reign was far from secure. His every decision was scrutinized, and any perceived weakness or fault could be seized upon by his rivals. If he was too lax in enforcing the rule, the pious conservatives would accuse him of corruption and leading the community into spiritual decay. If he was too harsh and demanding, he risked igniting a rebellion among the rank-and-file monks who grew weary of unbearable austerity. The most dramatic examples of this internal strife come from historical records that read like political thrillers. At the mighty Abbey of Cluny in the 12th century, a series of internal revolts tore the community apart. Monks dissatisfied with the leadership of Abbot Pons de Melgale accused him of mismanagement and moral failings. The conflict grew so severe that it required the personal intervention of the Pope, who eventually deposed Pons. But the drama didn't end there. Pons later returned with an armed force to literally seize control of the abbey back, turning a spiritual center into a fortified battleground. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, there are accounts of abbots being forcibly removed from office, dragged from their quarters, and exiled to remote dependent houses to live out their days in powerless obscurity. In the most extreme and chilling cases, these power struggles turned deadly. The historical record, while often veiled, hints at violence within the sacred walls. There are reports of abbots dying under mysterious circumstances that contemporaries openly labeled as murder. A sudden illness after a meal, a fatal fall down a flight of stairs in an otherwise empty tower. These could all be whispers of a darker reality. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing in the 12th century, tells of an abbot of St. Everald who was so hated for his tyranny that a group of monks conspired to poison him. While the plot was discovered and the perpetrators punished, the story exposes the terrifying depths of hatred that could flourish when absolute power was met with absolute resistance. It serves as a stark reminder that the cloister, for all its divine purpose, was still a human community, capable of harboring the same deadly ambitions that plagued royal courts and noble estates. The pursuit of power, it seems, could sanctify any space, but it could also corrupt any heart. This growing wealth created a deep and bitter divide within the monastery walls, a class system that ran completely counter to the ideal of a unified spiritual brotherhood. On one side were the choir monks, often drawn from noble or wealthy families, who were literate and spent their days in prayer, study, and the intricate art of copying manuscripts. They were the spiritual and intellectual elite. On the other side were the lay brothers, known as conversi. These were typically men from peasant or common backgrounds, illiterate and tasked with all the manual labor that sustained the community's lavish existence. They worked the fields, tended the livestock, repaired the buildings, and cooked the meals, all while following a stripped-down version of the monastic rule that allowed little time for the contemplative prayer that was the monastery's stated purpose. The resentment was palpable. While the choir monks ate refined meals, sang in well-heated churches, and handled priceless books, the lay brothers toiled from dawn until dusk, their hands calloused and their backs aching, all to support a lifestyle of privilege from which they were largely excluded. This wasn't just a division of labor, it was a spiritual caste system, and it frequently boiled over into open conflict. There are records from places like the great Abbey of St. Gallen where lay brothers organized protests or even work stoppages, a form of medieval strike against their spiritual superiors. They argued over food rations, the quality of their lodgings, and the relentless demands placed upon them. The very people who performed the most physically demanding work felt like second-class citizens in the house of God, a stark contradiction that fueled endless low-grade tension and occasional explosions of anger. The potential for corruption at the top was even more destructive. An abbot, acting as the sole administrator of the monastery's vast wealth, held almost unlimited power over its treasury with little oversight. While many were pious and prudent stewards, others succumbed to temptation. Historical accounts and satirical literature from the period are filled with caricatures of the greedy abbot, a man who lived more like a secular lord than a humble servant of God. He might embezzle funds meant for alms or repairs to expand his own private apartments, host lavish feasts for visiting nobility to increase his social standing, or use the monastery's resources as a personal bank to grant loans and favors to his family and allies. This misuse of funds didn't just breed hypocrisy, it directly harmed the community. A poor harvest or a harsh winter could lead to famine if the granaries had been sold off for personal profit, and the beautiful church might stand in disrepair while the abbot's chambers were adorned with tapestries and silver. The monks who had vowed poverty were forced to watch as their leader violated the very principles they were sacrificing everything to uphold. This erosion of trust could be fatal to the community's morale, creating an atmosphere of cynical disillusionment where the sacred felt increasingly profane. Perhaps the greatest irony was the monastery's frequent descent into the very practices the church officially condemned. many large abbeys became deeply involved in usury, the lending of money at interest. While technically forbidden for Christians, they found clever ways to circumvent the rules, such as charging high fees for late payment or structuring land leases in a way that functioned exactly like a high-interest loan. They would lend to impoverished local knights, struggling farmers, and even other religious houses, amassing more land and wealth when debts couldn't be repaid. This often brought them into fierce and sometimes violent disputes with their neighbors. A local lord who found his ancestral lands suddenly owned by the monastery after a bad debt might resort to threats or even raids to take it back. The monks, in turn, were not always peaceful victims. They had their own retainers and militia and were not afraid to appeal to kings or popes to defend their newly acquired property. The image of monks arguing over interest rates or sending armed men to secure a disputed field is a far cry from the peaceful isolation of the Desert Fathers. It shows an institution that had become deeply entangled in the gritty, materialistic world it was originally founded to escape. The pursuit of wealth, justified as necessary for survival and good works, had ultimately compromised the very soul of the enterprise, proving that no wall was high enough to keep out the corrupting influence of money and power. And yet, for all the power struggles and economic tensions that simmered within the monastery, perhaps no conflict was more intimate or more human than the one waged against the vow of chastity. This was a battle fought not in chapter houses or over-account ledgers, but in the quiet, lonely corners of the heart. The ideal was clear and absolute. By renouncing all physical relationships, a monk or nun could redirect their entire capacity for love and devotion solely toward God. It was a beautiful, transcendent concept, but the reality of human biology and emotion was a force that centuries of doctrine and discipline could never fully extinguish. In the enforced closeness of communal life, surrounded by the same faces day after isolated day, bonds of deep affection were inevitable. Sometimes that affection crossed the line from spiritual brotherhood into something more dangerous, more passionate, and utterly forbidden. The opportunities for secret encounters, while limited, were exploited with a creativity born of desperation. A nun and a monk might arrange to meet under the guise of a spiritual conference, using the screen of the convent parlor to whisper words that were anything but holy. Lay workers and servants, constantly moving in and out of the monastic precincts, became conduits for secret messages and even partners in clandestine affairs. The most common and devastating evidence of these broken vows was, of course, pregnancy. The discovery of a pregnant nun was a catastrophe that could shatter the reputation of an entire community. In some cases, the desperate mother would be quietly sent away to a distant relative to have the child, which would then be given up for adoption, the entire incident buried in silence. In more severe instances, the nun faced a lifetime of penance, walled into a tiny cell within the nunnery itself, living out her days in solitary confinement as a perpetual reminder of her sin. The written word also betrayed these hidden passions. Love letters, carefully concealed between the pages of a prayer book or passed by a trusted intermediary, provide some of the most poignant evidence of these relationships. The letters of Héloïse and Peter Abelard are the most famous example, a breathtaking chronicle of intellectual and physical passion between a brilliant theologian and his gifted student, who was also a nun. Their affair ended in tragedy and Abelard's brutal mutilation, but their correspondence survived, a timeless testament to the power of love to defy even the most rigid institutions. Within less famous walls, simpler, more heartbreaking notes must have been written and destroyed, their contents lost to history but their emotional truth echoing through the ages. Punishment for those caught was meant to be a deterrent to others, a public reaffirmation of the community's purity. a monk might be stripped to the waist and flogged before the entire chapter in a grim ceremony of humiliation. Expulsion was another common fate, casting the individual out of the only home and identity they had known for years, into a world for which they were utterly unprepared. This was a social and spiritual death sentence, yet it's crucial to understand that the enforcement of these rules was often inconsistent and deeply pragmatic. If the individuals involved were discreet and from powerful families, their transgressions might be quietly overlooked by an abbot or abbess eager to avoid a scandal that could bring external scrutiny. A low-ranking monk and a lay servant, however, would likely face the full, harsh weight of monastic law. This double standard reveals that even in matters of divine law, human politics and privilege held considerable sway. These stories of forbidden love are not just salacious gossip from the past. They are profound, deeply human reminders that the spiritual path has always been walked by people of flesh and blood, with all their complexities, weaknesses, and capacity for deep feeling. The vow of chastity sought to transcend human nature, but these hidden affections prove that nature is a relentless and powerful force. They show us that behind the stone walls and solemn rituals, behind every bowed head and folded hand, beat hearts fully capable of longing, passion, and the painful, complicated choice between sacred duty and human connection. This eternal struggle between the spirit and the flesh is what makes their stories and their silent heartbreaks so enduringly compelling. While the monastery's walls may have muffled the sounds of worldly life, they could do nothing to quiet the restless human mind. Within these silent halls, some of the most explosive conflicts weren't over land or love, but over ideas themselves. Monasteries were the intellectual powerhouses of the Middle Ages, housing vast libraries and some of the brightest thinkers of the age. This environment, designed for devout study, inevitably became a breeding ground for theological debate, and when those debates challenged the established doctrines of the Church, they could escalate into accusations of heresy with devastating consequences. This was a drama of the soul and the intellect, where the stakes were not just a position or a reputation, but eternal salvation itself. Consider the incredible intellectual freedom a monk possessed. His life was dedicated to reading, copying, and contemplating some of the most complex texts in existence, from the Church Fathers to ancient Greek philosophers preserved in Arabic translations. It was only natural that a brilliant, questioning mind, left alone with these thoughts for years, might arrive at a conclusion that diverged from official teaching. A monk might begin to question the nature of the Trinity, the authority of the Pope, or the very timeline of salvation history. In the outside world, such thoughts might have been shouted in a town square and quickly suppressed. But within the monastery, they could be nurtured in secret, discussed in hushed tones with a trusted few, and carefully written down in private notebooks. The very isolation that was meant to foster piety could also incubate radical, unorthodox beliefs. The story of Joachim of Fiore is a perfect and poignant example. A 12th century Cistercian abbot, Joachim was a revered mystic and biblical scholar. Through his intense study of scripture, he developed a revolutionary and compelling theory of history. He proposed that human existence was divided into three ages: the age of the Father, the Old Testament era of law and fear; the age of the Son, the current era of the Church and grace; and a coming age of the Spirit. This final age, he prophesied, would be a utopian epoch of direct spiritual understanding, where the institutional church would become unnecessary and humanity would live in perfect harmony and love. To modern ears, this might sound philosophical and harmless, but to the medieval church it was dynamite. Joachim's vision implicitly threatened the entire ecclesiastical structure, the papacy, the clergy, the sacraments, by suggesting their eventual obsolescence. Although he himself died in good standing, his ideas were later condemned as heretical. His followers, known as the Joachimites, were persecuted, and his writings were scrutinized for generations. His case shows how even a devout and respected monk, operating from within the system, could inadvertently unleash ideas powerful enough to threaten that very system from the inside. For others, the seclusion of the monastic cell provided the perfect cover for more deliberate acts of intellectual rebellion. Some monks became secret scribes of dissent, using their unparalleled skill in illumination and calligraphy to embed subversive messages into their work. In the margins of a beautifully illustrated psalm, an artist might draw a scene mocking a corrupt bishop. Within the intricate initials of a sacred text, a tiny, hidden image could symbolize a belief the church had condemned. These were acts of incredible courage and cunning. A heretic preaching in public could be easily burned, but an idea hidden in plain sight within a holy book could survive for centuries, waiting for a discerning eye to discover its true meaning. The monastery's scriptorium, the heart of orthodox learning, could thus be transformed into a workshop for heterodox thought. The punishment for those whose unorthodox ideas were discovered was severe and intended to serve as a warning to others. A monk accused of heresy faced a terrifying ordeal. He would be interrogated, often pressured to recant his beliefs, and if he refused, he could be excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments and the community, effectively condemning his soul. He might be exiled to a remote, punitive monastery, a prison within the religious world, or even handed over to secular authorities for imprisonment or execution. This created an atmosphere of intense intellectual fear. A monk had to constantly self-censor, weighing his private thoughts against the possibility of ruin. Yet, despite these risks, the flow of radical ideas never fully stopped. The pursuit of truth, or what an individual believed to be truth, proved to be a drive as powerful as any other human instinct. The silent, reverent atmosphere of the monastery library, with its dust motes dancing in the sunlight, was therefore one of the most paradoxically dangerous places in the medieval world, a place where a single, solitary thought could ignite a fire that threatened to consume everything. For some, the weight of the rule became an unbearable prison, and the call of the outside world grew louder than any vow of silence. The decision to escape a monastery or nunnery was one of the most desperate and radical acts of defiance imaginable. It meant abandoning not just a community, but an entire identity, a guaranteed livelihood, and in the eyes of the church, one's path to salvation. The risks were astronomical. If caught, an escapee faced severe punishment, flogging, imprisonment in a dank cell on a diet of bread and water, or being shackled in irons. In some extreme cases, they might even be branded on the forehead as a warning to others. Yet, despite these terrifying consequences, the historical record is dotted with accounts of those who chose to run. The motivations for escape were as varied as the individuals themselves. For some, it was a simple, crushing homesickness or an inability to adapt to the rigid, impersonal routine. A young nobleman forced into the monastic life by his family to preserve the inheritance for an older brother might yearn for the world of knights and courts he was denied. For others, the reason was more profound, a deep spiritual disillusionment. They may have entered with idealistic fervor, only to find the reality filled with the very human failings of jealousy, hypocrisy, and ambition they sought to escape. The silent, orderly life they were promised felt like a hollow performance, and their faith began to wither in the stagnant air of the cloister. Then there were those driven by pure, undeniable desire. A monk who had fallen in love with a woman from a nearby village during a rare trip outside the walls, or a nun who could no longer bear the separation from her children. The human heart, once awakened, could make any wall seem temporary. the methods of escape required immense courage and careful planning. Most monasteries were not maximum security prisons, but they were certainly designed to discourage casual departure. Gates were guarded, walls were high, and the surrounding lands were often owned by the monastery itself, meaning any unfamiliar face would be immediately noticed. Successful escapees often relied on outside help, a sympathetic family member who would provide secular clothing and a horse, or a local farmer willing to hide them in a cartload of hay. They would flee under the cover of darkness during a loud storm, or amidst the controlled chaos of a major feast day when vigilance might be lower. Their goals were just as diverse. Some simply vanished, hoping to blend into the anonymity of a large city and start a completely new life, perhaps as a scribe, a merchant, or a soldier, forever hiding their past. Others made a more theological statement by fleeing to a rival religious order that promised a stricter or more authentic spiritual experience, a direct repudiation of the community they left behind. The writings of the 13th century Flemish nun Beatrice of Nazareth offer us a rare and intimate window into this internal struggle. In her powerful spiritual autobiography, she doesn't describe a literal, physical escape, but she meticulously documents a profound yearning for a different kind of freedom. She writes of her intense, often agonizing desire to break free from the formal structures of communal religious life to pursue a more direct, personal, and ecstatic union with God. Her escape was a spiritual one, a rebellion of the heart against what she perceived as the limitations of the institutional path. Her words give voice to the silent anguish of countless others who may have felt the same intense conflict between their inner calling and the outer rules they were forced to obey. They remind us that the most powerful prisons are not always made of stone. These acts of flight, both physical and spiritual, are not just footnotes in history. They are powerful testimonies to the indomitable human spirit's quest for autonomy and authenticity. Every time a monk vaulted over a wall or a nun dreamed of a wider horizon, they were asserting a fundamental truth: that no institution, no matter how ancient or holy, can completely contain the individual soul. Their desperate journeys into the unknown stand as a permanent reminder that the path to grace is not one size fits all, and that for some, true devotion meant having the courage to walk away. While the drama of power, heresy, and escape unfolded in male monasteries, a parallel world of equally intense, yet often overlooked, struggles existed within the Nunneries. Here, women navigated a landscape of spiritual devotion complicated by the pervasive gender constraints of medieval society. A nunnery was not merely a female version of a monastery. It was a unique institution where the pursuit of God was filtered through the lens of womanhood, creating a distinct set of challenges and opportunities for drama, influence, and rebellion. The lives of these religious women were a constant balancing act between profound piety and the rigid expectations of a patriarchal world, and their stories add a crucial, rich layer to our understanding of monastic life. At the helm of these communities stood the abbess, a figure of remarkable and often contradictory authority. She was appointed to rule her nunnery with the same absolute power as a male abbot, governing spiritual life, managing often substantial estates, and exercising legal jurisdiction over her nuns and the surrounding lay population. An abbess from a powerful family could sit in councils with bishops and barons, correspond with popes, and wield influence that would be unimaginable for most secular women of her time. Yet, this authority was perpetually conditional and subject to challenge by the male ecclesiastical hierarchy. A bishop or a papal legate could override her decisions, and her autonomy was always contingent on not appearing too powerful or independent. This delicate dance, commanding absolute respect within her own walls while demonstrating appropriate deference to external male authority, required a level of political savvy that few kings ever had to master. The slightest misstep could provoke a crisis, inviting outside intervention that would undermine her leadership and the community's hard-won independence. This complex dynamic was amplified in the fascinating institution of the double monastery, a setup most famously associated with the early Anglo-Saxon Church, like the great foundation at Whitby under the legendary Abbess Hilda. In these communities, monks and nuns lived in separate quarters but shared a church and were governed by a single abbess. This arrangement, while practical for providing priests for the sacraments, was a powder keg of potential conflict. The abbess held ultimate authority over both the monks and the nuns, a reversal of the natural order as medieval society understood it. We can easily imagine the simmering resentments this could cause among the male clergy under her command. Jealousies over resource allocation were common. Did the nuns' quarters receive better provisions? Were the monks tasked with overly burdensome labor to support the entire community? The potential for scandalous gossip about inappropriate relationships between the sexes, however chaste they might actually be, was a constant threat that enemies could use to discredit the entire operation. Governing a double monastery required an abbess to be a diplomat, a CEO, and a spiritual mother simultaneously, all while navigating a minefield of gendered expectations. The story of Hildegard of Bingen perfectly illustrates both the immense influence a woman could achieve and the fierce pushback she could encounter. A 12th century abbess, composer, theologian, and visionary, Hildegard was a towering intellectual figure. She received what she described as divine visions and commanded to write them down, producing massive works on medicine, theology, and cosmology. Her authority stemmed directly from these mystical experiences, a source of power that was uniquely available to women, as it bypassed the need for the formal education from which they were often excluded. She advised popes, emperors, and bishops, and she even embarked on preaching tours, an activity almost unheard of for a woman, but this very influence made her a target. She faced constant scrutiny and criticism from male clerics who questioned the authenticity of her visions and challenged her right to teach and write on matters of doctrine. Her battles to establish a new, independent monastery for her nuns were met with bureaucratic resistance and claims that she was being prideful and disobedient. Hildegard's life was a continuous negotiation, using her status as a divinely inspired prophetess to carve out a space for action that would otherwise have been immediately closed to her. Beyond these famous examples, the daily life within a nunnery was filled with its own intimate dramas, shaped by the specific constraints of gender. Nunneries were often seen as respectable repositories for the unmarried daughters of the nobility, women who may not have had a personal religious calling but were placed there for family convenience. This could create a community divided between deeply devout mystics and discontented aristocrats who missed the worldly comforts and social freedoms of their former lives. These women might clash over the strictness of the rule, with some pushing for more austerity and others lobbying for more lenient visiting hours or better food. Economic pressures were also uniquely acute. While male monasteries could generate wealth through direct management of lands and industries, nunneries often faced greater restrictions on their economic activities and were more dependent on the fluctuating generosity of their patrons. The threat of poverty was never far away, and an abbess's ability to network, lobby, and protect her community's financial interests was a critical aspect of her role. Yet, within these tight constraints, women found astonishing ways to express agency and creativity. They became renowned for intricate embroidery and textile work, turning a domestic skill into a form of spiritual and artistic expression that also generated income. They composed music and poetry, often for internal use, creating a rich cultural life within their walls. They developed deep, spiritually intense friendships with one another, relationships that provided emotional support in their isolated world. In doing so, they transformed the nunnery from a simple place of confinement into a stage for a quiet, persistent rebellion, a demonstration that even when physically enclosed, the female intellect and spirit could not be contained. Their dramas may have been quieter, their rebellions more subtle than those of their male counterparts, but they were no less profound in their struggle to define a life of meaning on their own terms. Yet for all their role as guardians of ancient wisdom, monasteries were also gatekeepers, and the power to preserve knowledge inherently included the power to suppress it. The monastery library, or scriptorium, was not simply a neutral repository of books. It was a carefully curated and fiercely controlled intellectual landscape. Within those hushed, hallowed halls, a silent, high-stakes battle was constantly being waged over what ideas were safe to read, which were too dangerous to possess, and which were so threatening they had to be hidden away or destroyed entirely. This was a drama of intellect and ideology, where the very thoughts contained on a parchment page could be considered a greater threat than any sword. The librarian, often a senior and trusted monk, held one of the most sensitive and powerful positions in the entire community. His duty was a profound paradox. He was both the protector of knowledge and its chief censor. His first task was to decide what entered the library's collection in an age where every book was painstakingly copied by hand, an enormous investment of time and resources. A work of pagan philosophy like those by Aristotle or Plato, rediscovered through contact with the Islamic world, presented a terrifying dilemma. Its logic and reason were dazzling, but its conclusions were reached without any reference to Christian revelation. Was this a valuable tool for understanding God's creation, or a dangerous path toward heresy? The librarian, in consultation with the abbot, had to make that fateful call. Similarly, writings by Christian theologians that had later been condemned by the Church, the works of Origen or Arius, for example, posed a different problem. They were part of the Christian tradition, yet now deemed to contain fatal errors. To destroy them was to erase history, but to leave them accessible was to risk leading younger, impressionable monks into spiritual error. The librarian became the arbiter of orthodoxy, a solitary figure deciding what constituted truth and what constituted a threat. This tension between preservation and protection led to incredible acts of secret defiance. Some monks, believing certain texts were too precious to lose, became intellectual smugglers. They might take a banned book and not destroy it, but instead hide it away in a forgotten chest in a cellar, or behind a loose stone in a thick wall, creating a secret library within the library. Even more daringly, they might engage in a form of medieval encryption. A skilled scribe could copy a controversial text, but subtly alter its phrasing or embed its more radical ideas within a completely orthodox-looking commentary, creating a palimpsest of hidden meaning known only to the initiated. To an untrained eye, it was a standard theological treatise. To a trusted reader, it contained a coded message of dissent. This was knowledge as a covert operation, with monks risking their standing in the community to ensure that dangerous ideas survived for a future they believed would understand them better. The drama of this hidden knowledge often unfolded on a personal, visceral level. Imagine a young, intellectually curious novice assigned to dust the shelves in the deepest part of the library. His candle flickers as he pulls out a heavy, worn volume whose title has been scratched away from the leather binding. As he opens it, he realizes he's holding something he shouldn't, a passionate argument against the existence of hell, or a pagan text celebrating the physical world as the ultimate reality. His heart pounds with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Does he report his find to his superior, ensuring the book's likely destruction and perhaps earning a mild reprimand for his own curiosity? Or does he slide it back into the shadows, forever changed by the knowledge that the official, tidy doctrines he is being taught are not the whole story? This single moment of discovery could plant a seed of doubt that would shape his entire spiritual life, turning him from an obedient student into a secret seeker of forbidden truths. On the other side of this struggle was the abbot or prior, for whom censorship was an act of pastoral responsibility, not tyranny. In his view, he was protecting his spiritual flock from intellectual poison. The burning of a book was not an act of ignorance but a solemn, necessary right to safeguard souls. He genuinely feared that a single heretical idea, once let loose in the community, could create division, shatter faith, and damn individuals to eternal punishment. This fear was what gave the battle over books its immense emotional weight. It wasn't just about controlling information. It was about a collision of two deeply held convictions: the belief that all truth is God's truth and must be preserved, and the belief that some truths are too dangerous for fragile human minds to handle. This intellectual secrecy reveals that the monastery's greatest drama was not always about land, love, or power, but about the awesome, terrifying power of a simple idea to change everything. But even the thickest monastery walls could not keep the outside world at bay. These communities, for all their spiritual aspirations, were deeply embedded in the gritty realities of medieval politics and power. They existed in a precarious position, perpetually caught between two formidable forces: the local feudal lord who saw them as a source of revenue and influence, and the distant papal court in Rome that viewed them as instruments of broader ecclesiastical control. This constant tug of war over their loyalties, their wealth, and their very independence turned many a peaceful abbey into a reluctant player on a much larger geopolitical chessboard, where the stakes were not just spiritual but territorial and political. The relationship with the local nobility was a complex and often fraught dance of mutual dependence and resentment. A monastery's vast landholdings, granted by pious ancestors of these very nobles, made it a major economic player in the region. To a feudal baron or count, this made the abbey look less like a house of prayer and more like a wealthy vassal who wasn't paying its fair share. While monks were technically exempt from military service, lords frequently demanded gifts or aids, essentially forced taxes to fund their wars, repair their castles, or pay their ransoms. They might pressure an abbot to provide horses, grain, or even cash from the monastery's treasury, framing it as a matter of feudal obligation or local defense. Refusing such a request from an armed and powerful neighbor was a dangerous game. A displeased lord could easily resort to intimidation, sending his knights to accidentally damage monastic property, harass tenants, or blockade supply routes, effectively laying siege to the community without ever storming its walls. This constant low-grade extortion forced abbots to become not just spiritual leaders, but shrewd diplomats and negotiators, forever balancing their duty to protect the monastery's resources with the need to appease a potentially volatile patron. From the other direction came the long arm of the papacy. As the medieval church centralized its power, popes increasingly sought to bring powerful monasteries under their direct control, freeing them from the influence of local bishops and nobles. This was often done by granting a monastery the status of papal immunity, placing it directly under the protection of the Holy See. While this could be a valuable shield against a predatory local bishop or lord, it came at a steep price, a loss of local autonomy. The Pope, often thousands of miles away in Rome, could now directly appoint abbots, a practice known as lay investiture when done by secular rulers. but just as politically charged when done by the Pope. These appointments were rarely based on the spiritual merits of the candidate. Instead, they were political rewards given to relatives of powerful cardinals, allies of the papal court, or scholars whose theological views aligned with the current pontiff's agenda. Imagine the internal turmoil when a new abbot, a complete stranger to the community who didn't know its customs or its people, arrived with a mandate from Rome to implement unpopular reforms or redirect the monastery's wealth toward papal projects. The monks, who traditionally had a voice in electing their own leader from within their ranks, were now forced to accept an outsider imposed upon them, instantly creating factions of supporters and resentful opponents within the cloister. This clash between local and papal authority exploded spectacularly during the Investiture Controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries. This was a monumental power struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the ultimate right to appoint bishops and abbots, the spiritual head of Christendom or the temporal ruler of the land. Monasteries, especially the wealthy and influential imperial abbeys within the empire, found themselves on the front lines of this Cold War. An abbot appointed by the emperor would be considered illegitimate by the Pope and risk excommunication. An abbot appointed by the Pope would be seen as a traitor by the emperor and risk losing all his secular lands and protections. The monks themselves were torn. Their loyalties were split between their spiritual father in Rome and their earthly protector and sometimes benefactor, the emperor. This was no abstract debate. It could lead to real violence. Imperial troops might occupy a monastery to install an emperor-friendly abbot, while papal legates would stir up the local populace and clergy against him. A community could find itself divided, with one group of monks loyal to the Pope-driven abbot and another group secretly or openly supporting the imperial candidate. The very unity of the community, so essential to monastic life, could be shattered by forces entirely beyond its control. These immense external pressures inevitably seeped into the monastery's internal life, intensifying every existing drama. A power struggle between two factions of monks was no longer just about local leadership. It became a proxy war between the Pope and the local duke, a debate over economic policy. Should we invest in new land or beautify the church? Was now influenced by whether the decision would please a distant papal patron or anger a nearby feudal lord. The monks were forced to become political creatures, constantly reading the winds of change outside their walls and calculating how to navigate them. Their isolated world of prayer was, in truth, a crossroads where the great powers of medieval Europe met, and the quiet drama of the cloister became inextricably linked to the roaring conflicts of empires and popes. The quest for spiritual purity was forever complicated by the inescapable demands of a worldly chess game. Yet for all the emphasis on spiritual harmony, the preservation of order within the monastery relied on a chilling and rigid system of justice, a dark undercurrent flowing beneath the peaceful surface. This was not a world of gentle admonishments. It was a microcosm of medieval society, complete with its own laws, judges, and brutally effective means of enforcement. The abbot, acting as both spiritual father and absolute magistrate, held the power to investigate, judge, and sentence any member of his community for violations of the rule, from minor infractions like speaking out of turn to grave sins like heresy or repeated attempts to escape. The goal was correction and the purification of the individual soul, but the methods often crossed into the realm of psychological and physical terror, revealing how easily a structure built on divine love could resort to human cruelty in the name of discipline. The spectrum of punishment was wide and graduated, designed to fit the perceived severity of the crime. For minor faults, a missed prayer, a poorly performed task, a moment of idle chatter, the corrections were often public and humiliating. A monk might be forced to lie prostrate at the entrance to the chapter house, so that every one of his brothers had to step over him on their way to assembly. He might be denied his portion of wine at meals or assigned extra hours of the most grueling manual labor. The intent was to use shame and discomfort as a teaching tool, reinforcing the collective identity of the group by visibly ostracizing the individual who had strayed. More serious transgressions, such as persistent disobedience or acts of violence, merited corporal punishment. The ritual of the flogging was a solemn and terrifying event. The entire community would be gathered, prayers would be said, and the guilty party, stripped to the waist, would be scourged with a whip or a bundle of rods, often by the abbot himself or the prior. The number of strokes was prescribed, and the whole ceremony was designed to be as much a spiritual cleansing as a physical penalty, a brutal reenactment of the chastisement of sin. But the most feared punishments were those that involved complete isolation, the removal of an individual from the community, not just physically but sensorially. Monasteries often contained special cells, little more than closets, where a rebellious monk would be locked away for days or weeks on a diet of bread and water. This was solitary confinement in its most primitive form, a profound psychological torture for someone whose entire life was built around communal existence. The silence here was not golden, it was a weapon. In some of the larger and more severe establishments, there were even more horrifying structures known as oubliettes. Derived from the French word oublier, meaning to forget, these were underground dungeons, often simply pits accessed by a trapdoor in the ceiling. A monk condemned to the oubliette was literally forgotten, lowered into a dark, damp hole with no light, no human contact, and left to die of starvation, exposure, or madness. It was a living burial, a sentence that declared an individual not just guilty, but utterly erased from the community of the living and the saved. The accounts of visitors to these monasteries provide haunting glimpses into this darker reality. The chronicler Eadmer of Canterbury in the 11th century wrote of the eerie atmosphere that could pervade even the most renowned abbeys. He described the usual peaceful silence of the divine offices being suddenly punctuated by the distant, muffled cries of a brother undergoing punishment, a jarring dissonance that exposed the grim machinery operating behind the devotional facade. This was the central, heartbreaking contradiction of the monastic penal system. Practices that were justified as necessary medicine for the soul to scourge out sin and pride often had the opposite effect. Instead of fostering repentance, they bred deep-seated resentment, paranoia, and a culture of fear. A monk might obey not out of love for God or his community, but out of a terrified desire to avoid the lash or the dark cell. The constant threat of punishment could turn the cloister into a panopticon, where brothers policed each other and reported minor infractions to curry favor with the authorities, destroying the very trust and charity that was supposed to be the foundation of their life together. What began as a structure for maintaining order could, in the wrong hands, descend into a theater of control and outright cruelty, proving that the pursuit of perfection, when enforced by human hands, could cast very long and very dark shadows. Amidst the struggles for power, the whispers of secret love, and the clatter of economic ambition, there existed another, far more transcendent form of hidden drama, one that unfolded not in shadowy corridors, but in the deepest, most luminous corners of the human soul. For some monks and nuns, the ultimate rebellion was not against the rules of the monastery, but against the very limits of earthly experience itself. They were the mystics, individuals who reported profound, often overwhelming, encounters with the divine that bypassed all human intermediaries. These experiences were the source of the most beautiful and the most dangerous drama of all, a direct challenge to the institution from within, powered by what the institution itself claimed to serve, the voice of God. The path of the mystic was a solitary and terrifying one. It often began not with scholarship or ritual, but with a visceral, uncontrollable event, a vision, a voice, a sensation of ecstatic union that shattered the normal rhythms of prayer and work. A nun like Mechthild of Magdeburg, a 13th-century beguine later attached to a Dominican convent, did not choose her calling, it was thrust upon her. She described being flooded with a light that was not of this world, engaged in conversations with Christ that were as real to her as any human interaction. She was commanded to write these experiences down, to give form to the ineffable. This placed her in an impossible position. Her authority came not from years of theological study, not from an appointment by a bishop, and certainly not from her gender in a male-dominated church. It came from a source she could not control and could barely explain, a source that claimed the highest possible legitimacy. Her very existence as a visionary was a silent critique of the entire clerical structure, proving that God could and would speak directly to a lowly woman, bypassing the entire chain of command. This direct line to the divine inevitably created a fault line between personal revelation and institutional doctrine. The Church's authority was built on a foundation of scripture, tradition, and the sacraments administered by its ordained priests. A mystic like Mechthild claimed an additional, living source of truth that existed outside of that control. When her writings described the Godhead in strikingly intimate and personal terms, or offered new insights into the nature of heaven and hell, it forced a difficult question. Was this a genuine revelation to be celebrated, or a dangerous delusion to be suppressed? The mystic was forever walking a razor's edge. The same experience that could elevate her to the status of a revered saint one day could just as easily be condemned as heretical fantasy the next. Everything depended on the alignment of her message with current orthodoxies and the political winds blowing through Rome. A description of God's love that was too sensual, too emotional, or too egalitarian could trigger alarm bells among the guardians of doctrine, who feared such ideas could lead the faithful astray. The tension often played out in a dramatic, psychological tug of war. A mystic, convinced of the truth of her experiences but terrified of the consequences of sharing them, might resist the divine command to write for years. We see this in the writings of many female visionaries who consistently downplayed their own roles, attributing their work entirely to God's insistence in an attempt to shield themselves from charges of pride. They would seek out a sympathetic, usually male, confessor to vet their writings and provide a layer of ecclesiastical protection. This relationship was itself a delicate dance. The confessor could be an ally, helping to translate her ineffable experiences into acceptable theological language, or he could become a censor, silencing anything he found too radical. The survival of a mystic's work often hinged on finding a patron within the church powerful enough to defend her. For every mystic who was eventually canonized, like Hildegard of Bingen or Catherine of Siena, there were countless others who faced suspicion, investigation, and condemnation. Their dramas were not fought with weapons or money, but with words and ideas. An inquisitor would arrive to interrogate them, probing their visions for any deviation from accepted teaching. Their writings would be scrutinized for a single misplaced phrase that could be twisted into evidence of heresy. The punishment was not a cell or a flogging, but something potentially worse, excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that cut them off from the sacraments and the community of the faithful. This constant threat forced mystics to become masters of coded language, embedding their most radical ideas in layers of metaphor and symbol, trusting that future generations might understand what their own could not. Yet, the legacy of these individuals is a testament to the irresistible power of a direct encounter with the sacred. Their struggles highlight the eternal conflict between the organized, hierarchical religion of the institution and the wild, uncontrollable religion of the spirit. They remind us that the most profound dramas are not always about human failure, but about the terrifying and glorious collision between the human and the divine. In their quest to describe the indescribable, they did not just challenge the Church, they expanded the very boundaries of faith, leaving behind a body of literature that continues to inspire and unsettle, a permanent record of the moment when the silence of the cloister was broken not by a whisper, but by a voice that claimed to speak for heaven itself. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, a catastrophe arrived that made all previous internal conflicts seem trivial. The Black Death did not knock politely at the monastery gate. It smashed through the walls with a terrifying, indiscriminate fury. This was not a crisis of faith or governance, but a visceral, biological apocalypse that tested the very core of the monastic vocation. The plague's arrival transformed these secluded communities into frontline hospitals, charnel houses, and ultimately, crucibles where every vow and every belief was subjected to a trial by fire. The routines of the horarium, the sacred rhythm of prayer, work, and study that had structured life for centuries shattered overnight, replaced by the frantic, grim tasks of nursing the dying and burying the dead. The scale of the mortality was simply unimaginable. Some monasteries were virtually wiped out. Chroniclers of the time report houses where every single monk or nun perished, their bodies left to be discovered by terrified visitors days later. In others, 2/3 or 3/4 of the community succumbed in a matter of weeks. The cloister, designed to be a protected space set apart from the world, became a death trap. The very practices of communal living, eating together, sleeping in shared dormitories, chanting in close quarters during the divine office, accelerated the spread of the disease. The silence was now broken not by whispered secrets, but by the sound of ragged coughing and the prayers for the dying. This extreme pressure forced every individual to make a choice that defined their character and their legacy. For some, the instinct for self-preservation overpowered their sacred vows. There are accounts, though often written by critics after the fact, of monks and nuns abandoning their posts, fleeing into the countryside in a desperate attempt to outrun the pestilence. They broke their vow of stability, choosing earthly life over their promised heavenly reward, and in doing so, left their sick and dying brethren to face the end alone. The psychological torment of those who fled must have been immense, living with the knowledge that they had chosen fear over duty. But for every story of flight, there are countless more of incredible, saintly courage. Many clergy, seeing themselves as physicians of the soul, felt a divine obligation to stay and minister to the suffering, both within the monastery and in the surrounding villages. They performed the last rites. Here yet this cycle of spiritual decay and renewal was about to face its greatest challenge yet. Just as the Cluniacs and Cistercians were locked in their ideological struggle, a far more existential threat was gathering force on the horizon, one that would render their debates suddenly trivial and test the very survival of monasticism itself. The 14th century was about to unleash a cataclysm that would shatter all structures, sacred and secular alike, but that is a story for our next chapter. While the monastery's justice system enforced order through fear, and the mystics sought truth through divine visions, another form of silent expression flourished in the most celebrated of spaces, the scriptorium. Here, amidst the smell of ink and vellum, a different kind of rebellion was taking place, one etched in gold leaf and brilliant pigments. The creation of illuminated manuscripts was far more than a pious chore. For many monks, it was their life's work and a rare outlet for personal expression. Within the sacred letters and ornate borders of these holy books, they found a way to embed their own commentary, their frustrations, and even their humor, creating a secret visual language that could be understood by those in the know. The most common form of this hidden commentary was satire, aimed squarely at the very authorities the scribe was supposed to revere. An illuminator, perhaps frustrated by an abbot he saw as greedy or hypocritical, might subtly incorporate the face of that abbot into the depiction of a damned soul in a scene of the Last Judgment. In the marginalia, the often ignored borders of the page, a monk could draw a fox preaching to a flock of geese, a clear and daring jab at a clergy more interested in rhetoric than true spirituality. These were not just doodles, they were calculated acts of defiance. The monk took a tremendous risk, knowing that if his intention was discovered, he could face severe punishment. But the very sanctity of the book provided a layer of protection. Who would dare deface a holy text to remove a suspicious-looking creature in the corner? The sacredness of the medium became the perfect shield for subversive thought. Beyond political critique, these manuscripts also served as a repository for esoteric and mystical beliefs that might have been frowned upon by church orthodoxy. The incredibly intricate, interwoven patterns found in insular manuscripts like the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospels are often described simply as decorative. But many scholars believe they are anything but. These complex knots and spirals with no beginning and no end may have been visual representations of divine infinity, a concept difficult to express in words. For a mystic monk illustrating the Gospel of John, he might choose to encode a specific number of patterns or creatures into the design, a number holding deep Kabbalistic or personal spiritual significance. This was a way of embedding a second, deeper text within the primary one, a layer of meaning accessible only to those initiated into its symbolic language. The art became a silent sermon, a personal meditation on the divine that existed in plain sight. This practice required immense skill and offered the artist a unique form of agency. A scribe was expected to be anonymous, to erase his personality in service to God and the text, but through his art he could leave a subtle signature, not of his name but of his mind. The choice of colors, the specific way a dragon's tail was curved, the expression on the face of an angel, these were all tiny declarations of self. In a life governed by rigid conformity, the illuminated page became one of the few places where a monk could exercise true individuality and creativity. It was a sanctioned form of expression that could, with careful skill, be twisted into something profoundly personal and even dissenting. Unraveling these visual codes today is like listening to one half of a whispered conversation from 1,000 years ago. We can see the symbols but can never be entirely certain of their intended meaning. Was that owl a symbol of wisdom or a covert nod to darkness and sin? Was the RABBIT Chinese letter a simple sign of fertility or an inside joke among the scribes? This ambiguity is precisely what makes these works so endlessly fascinating. They remind us that these monks were not robotic copyists. They were complex individuals with inner lives, critiques, and a deep, often playful creativity. The next time you see an image of a medieval manuscript, look closer at the margins. Those bizarre, beautiful, and sometimes unsettling creatures are not mere decoration. They are the whispers of the cloister, frozen in time and color, a silent testament to the human spirit's irrepressible need to speak its truth. Beneath the grand narratives of power and rebellion, the true texture of monastic life was woven from the relentless, repetitive threads of the daily grind. The engine of this existence was the horarium, the ironclad daily schedule that governed every single hour, from before sunrise until long after dark. This was not a gentle suggestion but a sacred rhythm, a metronome for the soul designed to eliminate idleness, which the rule of Saint Benedict called the enemy of the soul. Imagine the jarring clang of a bell piercing the pre-dawn darkness, summoning the community for the first service of the day, matins. This would be followed by lauds at sunrise, and then at 3-hour intervals throughout the day, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before bed. Between these prayers came blocks of time for manual labor, meals, and sacred reading. This rigid structure left absolutely no room for spontaneity or personal whim. Your body was not your own. It was an instrument to be played according to the divine schedule. The mental and physical exhaustion of this relentless cycle, broken sleep, hours of standing and chanting in a cold church, demanding physical work, created a constant, low hum of stress that made everyone raw, where even the smallest irritation could feel like a major provocation. Within this pressurized environment, the deeply ingrained class divide between choir monks and lay brothers fueled 1,000 petty resentments that simmered just below the surface. The choir monks, the literate elite, spent their labor hours in the relative comfort and quiet of the scriptorium, copying manuscripts or studying. Their work was revered, their voices were essential to the beautiful chanting of the offices. The lay brothers, by contrast, were the muscle. Their labor was back-breaking, plowing fields, hauling stones, mucking out stables, and working in the noisy, smoky kitchens. At mealtimes, this hierarchy was visibly enforced. The choir monks might dine on slightly better bread, a more generous portion of fish, or a taste of wine, while the conversi made do with simpler fare. A cook, who was often a lay brother himself, held a position of peculiar power. He could quietly hoard the best bits of food for his friends, or subtly punish a choir monk he disliked by serving him a skimpy portion or an undercooked vegetable. These were tiny acts of defiance, a way to exert control in a life that offered them very little. A missing kitchen knife or a broken hoe wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It could spark a furious, whispered investigation, with accusations flying between the two groups, each suspecting the other of negligence or outright theft. Even among the choir monks, competition and pride festered in unexpected places. The scriptorium, that hallowed space of learning, could become a hotbed of quiet rivalry. A gifted scribe and illuminator whose hands could bring biblical scenes to breathtaking life might be celebrated and given the most prestigious projects. This could stir deep jealousy in an older monk whose own skills were fading, whose lines were now shaky, and who was relegated to mending old books or preparing parchment. The choice of who got to illuminate the Christmas Gospels or copy a beloved psalter was a decision laden with unspoken favoritism. A beautifully executed initial could be a source of immense personal pride, a silent boast that violated the vow of humility. Conversely, a mistake, a blotched ink spill on a months-long project, could lead to a devastating private shame and very public rebuke from the scriptorium master. The pressure to produce perfect, beautiful work for the glory of God was immense, and it often tangled with very human egos. The most poignant dramas, however, were the most personal. The sheer lack of privacy meant that everyone knew everyone else's small failings. There was the brother who was always, without fail, a few seconds late for prayers, his hurried entrance drawing a chorus of disapproving glances. There was the one who snored thunderously in the dormitory, robbing his neighbors of precious sleep. There was the novice who secretly fed his scraps to the monastery cat under the table, a tiny rebellion against the rule of silence during meals. These were not historical events recorded in chronicles, but they were the very fabric of daily life. A stolen hour of sleep, a warm pastry pocketed from the kitchen, a shared, knowing eye roll during a particularly long-winded sermon from the abbot. These tiny acts were the ways these individuals reclaimed a sliver of selfhood. They remind us that these were not two-dimensional icons of piety, but real people with short tempers, aching feet, and a desperate need for a moment of quiet laughter. The miracle of the monastery was not that it was populated by perfect saints, but that this diverse collection of flawed, tired, and often irritable human beings managed to keep the bell ringing and the chant rising day after day, year after year, building something enduring not in spite of their humanity, but through it. But within this spiritual brotherhood, a stark and deeply ingrained class system thrived, a mirror of the feudal world the monastery was supposed to transcend. This division was most painfully clear in the figure of the lay brother or conversus. These were men who took religious vows but remained separate from the educated choir monks. Typically drawn from the peasantry or artisan classes, they were illiterate, and their devotion was expressed not through Latin psalms but through the sweat of their brow. They were the engine of the monastery, ploughing the fields, tending the vast flocks of sheep, forging iron in the blacksmith shop, and baking the daily bread that fed the entire community. Theirs was a life of relentless manual labor from dawn until dusk, with a simplified schedule of prayers that fit around their grueling workload. While the choir monks chanted in the beautifully illuminated church, the lay brothers were often in a far more plain and separate chapel, their worship considered a lesser offering. This created a bitter, simmering resentment. They performed the most physically demanding work that generated the monastery's wealth, yet they lived as second-class citizens within God's own house, denied the education, the comfortable quarters, and the social status of their cloistered brethren. This resentment occasionally boiled over into open rebellion, shattering the illusion of peaceful harmony. One of the most dramatic examples erupted in the early 13th century at the great Abbey of St. Gall, a powerhouse of learning and culture. The lay brothers there, pushed to their breaking point by what they saw as exploitation and contempt from the choir monks, organized a full-scale strike. They refused to work in the tightly controlled economy of a monastery. This was an act of devastating effectiveness. Without their labor, the fields would go untended, the animals unfed, and the entire complex would grind to a halt. The situation grew so tense and volatile that it escalated into outright violence. The lay brothers, in a stunning act of defiance, physically seized control of the abbey's tower, using it as a stronghold. This wasn't just a complaint, it was an armed occupation of their own spiritual home. The standoff was only resolved by the intervention of a bishop from a neighboring diocese, who negotiated a settlement. While the exact terms are lost to history, the event itself stands as a permanent testament to the deep-seated class anger that festered behind the abbey walls, proving that vows of poverty and obedience could not erase a fundamental desire for dignity and fair treatment. And the monastery's connection to the outside world and all its temptations was maintained through a constant flow of servants and outside workers. Unlike the professed lay brothers, these were secular men and women hired from the local villages for specific tasks. They brought in fresh supplies, delivered messages, worked as skilled stonemasons on building projects, or helped with the harvest. These individuals were not bound by any vow of silence or separation. They were the gossips, the newsbringers, the living link to the world of marriages, markets, and political scandals that the monks had supposedly left behind. A carpenter repairing a cloister bench might share a juicy tale of a local lord's affair. A milkmaid might flirt innocently with a young lay brother as she delivered her churns. They were a walking, talking reminder of the life the monks had renounced, and their presence constantly tested the resolve of those within. They eroded the prized isolation of the cloister, making its walls more symbolic than real. Through them, worldly anxieties, desires, and distractions seeped into the sacred compound, ensuring that the monastery remained, for all its aspirations, a deeply human institution, forever entangled with the very society it sought to rise above. Imagine the deep of night in a monastery, where the only sounds are the wind sighing through stone corridors and the distant, rhythmic breathing of sleeping brothers. In such a place where silence and shadow reign, the mind begins to play tricks. A creak from the old timber isn't just a settling building, it becomes the footstep of something unseen. A draft under a door isn't merely a change in air pressure, it's the chilling breath of a spirit passing by. For medieval monks, the supernatural was not a matter of fantasy or entertainment, it was a fundamental part of their reality. An entire unseen dimension that interacted with their daily lives in ways both terrifying and instructive. Their world was a thin place, where the veil between the physical and the spiritual was believed to be porous and constantly shifting. This pervasive belief in the supernatural was a powerful tool for explaining the unexplainable. In an age before germ theory, a sudden, virulent illness sweeping through the dormitory was not seen as a random act of nature. It was a sign. Perhaps it was divine punishment for a collective sin the community had committed, a warning to repent. Or maybe it was the malicious work of a demon, summoned by some hidden act of witchcraft or heresy within their own ranks. Even a sacred object could be the source of terror. A relic, a bone of a saint or a fragment of the true cross was meant to be a source of healing and protection. But if misfortune followed its arrival, whispers would begin. Was the relic itself cursed? Had it been somehow desecrated, its holy power inverted into something dark and dangerous? These were not idle questions. They were urgent attempts to make sense of suffering and death in a theological framework, to find a reason in the chaos. The architecture of the monastery itself could become a character in these ghostly dramas. Older foundations were often built on ancient pagan sites, a common practice intended to supplant local spirits with the Christian God. But for the monks living there, the past never truly went away. Stories would persist of the old gods or land spirits, now recast as demons or restless ghosts who still wandered their former sacred ground. A crypt beneath the church, filled with the bones of generations of departed brothers, was not just a historical archive, it was a place where the dead were literally ever present. The strange, echoing noises that sometimes rose from such places were not dismissed as imagination. They were the voices of the departed, perhaps souls trapped in purgatory, crying out for the prayers of the living to ease their torment. Every shadowy corner, every cold spot in a hallway could be evidence of an unseen resident. These stories, passed down in hushed tones during rare moments of permitted conversation, served a crucial dual purpose. On one hand, they were vivid moral fables, a tale about a monk being haunted by a specter until he confessed a long-hidden theft, reinforced the importance of honesty and the terrible weight of a guilty conscience. A story of a demon appearing to a brother who had skipped his prayers emphasized the constant danger of spiritual laziness. The supernatural was a narrative device used to enforce the rule and maintain social order, making abstract sins concrete and their consequences terrifyingly immediate. But on a deeper, more psychological level, these ghost stories were also a mirror reflecting the monks' own deepest anxieties. They lived a life of intense scrutiny, where every thought and action was supposed to be oriented toward God. The pressure to be perfect, to suppress natural human desires and doubts, was immense. The terrifying figure of a demon could be a projection of their own internal struggles with temptation, a physical manifestation of the lust, pride, or anger they fought to keep locked away. A haunting might represent the fear that their hidden sins would one day be exposed to the light, no matter how well they thought they had concealed them. The restless dead were a constant memento mori, a reminder of their own mortality and the terrifying judgment that awaited them, where every secret would be revealed. This belief in an active, intervening supernatural world profoundly shaped their behavior. It wasn't just about fear, it was about navigating a world alive with invisible forces. Monks would devoutly wear protective amulets inscribed with prayers or the names of angels to ward off evil spirits. They might perform small, private rituals blessing their cell with holy water before sleep, or saying extra prayers for protection during a storm, which was often seen as a battle between angels and demons in the heavens. The line between approved Christian practice and superstition was often blurry, a testament to the very human need to feel a sense of control over the frightening and the unknown. In the end, the ghost stories of the monastery tell us less about monsters and more about the men who believed in them. They reveal a community grappling with fear, guilt, and the awesome mystery of death, using the language of the supernatural to understand the shadows both outside their doors and within their own souls. Yet for all its enforced isolation, the medieval monastery was never truly a world unto itself. Its walls, both physical and spiritual, were constantly tested by the comings and goings of its own members and a steady stream of outsiders. Two of the most powerful forces breaching this sanctity were the Crusades and pilgrimages, movements that pulled monks out of their seclusion and thrust them into the heart of a vast, diverse, and often dangerous world. When these travelers returned, they didn't just bring back souvenirs. They carried with them new ideas, new conflicts, and a profoundly altered perspective that could shake the foundations of their once insular community. Consider the extraordinary journey of a monk who answered the call to crusade. Leaving the predictable rhythm of the herarium behind, he would march for thousands of miles across unfamiliar landscapes. He would witness the stunning intellectual and cultural achievements of the Islamic world, encountering cities like Antioch or Constantinople that dwarfed anything in Europe. He might meet Eastern Christian priests whose rites and theology, though ancient, seemed bizarre and suspicious to his Western eyes. This exposure was an intellectual earthquake. A monk trained to see non-Christians as simple infidels might instead find himself in philosophical debate with a Muslim scholar whose knowledge of Aristotle was far superior to his own. He might develop a grudging respect for the enemy's piety or military honor. Upon returning home, this monk was inevitably changed. For some, the violence and horror of crusading led to a crisis of faith, a deep disillusionment with the church that had sanctioned such bloodshed in God's name. They returned quieter, more contemplative, and perhaps more skeptical of the certainties they had once been taught. For others, the experience had the opposite effect, forging a fanatical zealotry. They came back hardened, more intolerant, and eager to purge any hint of the foreign influences they now saw as a dire threat, potentially turning them into harsh critics of their own more moderate brethren. Pilgrimages, while less overtly violent, presented a different kind of disruption. A monk granted permission to make a pilgrimage to Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or the Holy Land was embarking on the adventure of a lifetime. The road was a great equalizer, throwing him together with nobles, merchants, thieves, and prostitutes, the very people he had vowed to avoid. He would hear vulgar jokes, political gossip from distant courts, and heretical ideas discussed openly around campfires. The sheer diversity of human experience on the pilgrim trail was a stark contrast to the homogenized life of the cloister. When he finally returned, he wasn't just a monk who had been away, he was a man of the world, whether he wanted to be or not. His stories of distant lands and strange customs would captivate his brothers during the rare recreation periods, subtly expanding their view of creation and making their own monastery feel just a little smaller and more provincial. The traffic wasn't just one way. Monasteries located on major pilgrimage routes, like those along the road to Canterbury or through the Alps into Italy, found themselves transformed into bustling hostels for travelers. This constant influx of outsiders was a double-edged sword. It brought prestige and generous donations, but it also shattered the precious silence and isolation. The cloister, once a sanctuary for quiet prayer, now echoed with the clamor of dozens of guest nobles demanding fine service, sick pilgrims seeking miraculous cures, and garrulous travelers eager to share the latest news from the world. This was how scandals and ideas spread like wildfire. A pilgrim might casually mention a bishop's disgrace in a far-off diocese, or a new theological debate raging at a university in Paris. Worse, they brought disease. Crowded guest halls were perfect breeding grounds for sickness, and a single infected traveler could unknowingly unleash an epidemic within the enclosed community, as many monasteries tragically discovered during outbreaks of plague. And then there was the drama of human connection. The line between a pious pilgrim and a handsome stranger could blur quickly for a lonely nun or a monk starved for worldly interaction. Forbidden romances could spark in the charged atmosphere of a shared journey or during a confessional conversation in a monastery's guest house. There are records of pilgrims prolonging their stay near a particular abbey, of secret letters being exchanged, and of monks or nuns becoming so enchanted by a visitor's tales of freedom that they began to plot their own escape. The pilgrim, an agent of the sacred, could thus inadvertently become an agent of temptation, their very presence a reminder of the life of movement, choice, and personal connection that those within the walls had renounced. These journeys, both those taken and those hosted, proved that the monastery was not a sealed fortress but a living, breathing organism, forever being changed by the world it so desperately tried to keep at bay. Yet for all their spiritual devotion, the sheer scale of a major monastery's operations demanded a level of wealth that often proved incompatible with the vow of poverty. This fundamental tension gave rise to one of the most fascinating and paradoxical dramas of monastic life, the development of a thriving shadow economy, where the sacred and the profane became deeply and often shamelessly entangled. While the outside world saw these institutions as beacons of piety, many were also running sophisticated commercial enterprises, and some were not above bending or breaking both secular and church law to protect their financial interests. This was a world of whispered deals in Abbot's private chambers, of goods moved under cover of darkness, and of a constant, quiet negotiation between the soul's salvation and the institution's survival. The most common form of this covert trade was the simple and very human desire to avoid paying taxes. Monasteries, despite their religious status, were still subject to various tolls and tariffs when transporting goods across the lands of local lords or into towns. To bypass these costly fees, a resourceful cellarer or obedientiary might orchestrate a bit of nocturnal smuggling. A cartload of the abbey's famously rich wine or wool, clearly marked for sale at market, would be a target for tax collectors. But that same cart, disguised as a delivery of straw or stone, and moving along a little-known forest track after sundown, could save the house a significant sum of money. This was not seen as grand theft, but as prudent financial management, a way to steward the community's resources more effectively, even if it required a bit of deception. The monks rationalized these acts by viewing the local nobility's taxes as an unfair imposition on God's work, making their evasion a form of holy cunning. But the trade went far beyond basic tax avoidance. Some monasteries, particularly those with a specialty product, developed intricate and sometimes illegal networks to maximize their profits. The monks of Canterbury, for instance, were renowned for their high-quality wool. Church regulations, however, often restricted trade with certain regions or merchants to protect local economies. Undeterred, the Canterbury monks established a lucrative and clandestine partnership with Flemish weavers, who paid a premium for their fine English wool. This meant secretly shipping their product across the Channel, deliberately circumventing official English trade channels and the Crown's taxes. It was a high-risk, high-reward operation that required the complicity of sailors, merchants, and port officials, weaving the monastery into a web of secular corruption that stood in stark contrast to its spiritual mission. Perhaps the most shocking and profitable branch of this shadow economy was the trade in sacred objects, relics. The medieval thirst for relics was insatiable. A monastery that possessed a finger bone of a major saint or a splinter from the true cross could become a major pilgrimage destination, guaranteeing a steady flow of wealth from devout visitors. This created a ferocious and often unscrupulous market. Some monasteries turned to outright forgery, but others engaged in a form of holy smuggling. A monk with connections in the Holy Land might arrange for the discovery and transport of a new relic, bypassing the usual ecclesiastical authorities who would demand a cut or outright ownership of the priceless object. These sacred contraband items would be smuggled into the abbey in great secrecy and then, miraculously, discovered in a dramatic ceremony, ensuring all donations and pilgrimage revenue flowed directly to the house that orchestrated the pious fraud. The line between devout acquisition and cynical commerce became impossibly thin. This double life placed every monk involved in a state of profound moral conflict. The cellarer, who kept two sets of account books, one for the bishop's inspection and one that recorded the real, off-the-books transactions, was lying to his religious superiors. The abbot, who wined and dined a wealthy merchant to secure a favorable deal, was engaging in the same worldly politicking he had vowed to renounce. They justified it all by repeating the same mantra: it was for the good of the community. The money was needed to feed the poor, to repair the church roof, to purchase new books for the library. But with every successful clandestine deal, the spiritual cost grew. The monastery, founded as a refuge from worldly greed, was now being sustained by it, its leaders becoming more skilled in commerce than in contemplation. The shadow economy reveals the ultimate monastic paradox: the desperate and often corrupting measures required to maintain an institution dedicated to denying the very world it depended on for its survival. But while the daily grind and the shadow economy shaped the internal world of the monastery, it was the legendary rebels who truly captured the imagination of the outside world and left an indelible mark on history. These were not mere malcontents. They were brilliant, passionate, and often tragically flawed individuals whose personal struggles against the monastic system exploded into public scandals that shook the very foundations of medieval society. Their stories became powerful cultural touchstones, demonstrating that a single voice of dissent, raised from within the heart of the institution, could resonate for centuries, inspiring both awe and fear in equal measure. The tale of Peter Abelard and Heloise stands as the archetype of romantic and intellectual rebellion. In the 12th century, Abelard was not just a monk, he was the most celebrated philosopher and theologian in Paris, a rock-star academic whose lectures drew students from across Europe. His affair with Heloise, his brilliant and gifted student, was a scandal of epic proportions because it violated every pillar of the life he was supposed to lead. It was a betrayal of his vow of chastity, certainly, but more profoundly, it was a collision between raw, human genius and the rigid rules designed to contain it. Their passionate exchange of letters, which survived their tragedy, reveals a relationship built not merely on physical attraction, but on a deep meeting of two formidable minds. When Héloïse became pregnant and their secret was exposed, the revenge of her guardian was brutal and symbolic. Abelard was attacked and emasculated, physically neutering the source of his transgression. Forced into monastic life, Abelard's rebellion continued. His theological writings, which emphasized reason and logic in understanding faith, repeatedly brought him into conflict with church authorities and led to his books being burned. His life became a potent symbol of the unbearable tension between human desire and spiritual ambition, between the pursuit of knowledge and the demands of orthodoxy. He was a heretic to some, a martyr to love and reason to others, but his story forever linked the idea of intellectual freedom with personal sacrifice. In stark contrast to Abelard's personal passion stood the fiery, apocalyptic rebellion of Girolamo Savonarola in 15th century Florence. A Dominican friar, Savonarola was a rebel of pure, uncompromising spirit. He launched a direct assault on the corruption he saw in the highest echelons of the Church, including the decadent papacy of Alexander VI. From his pulpit, he preached not love but fear, a fear of God's imminent judgment and the need for urgent moral reform. His power grew so immense that he effectively took political control of Florence, turning the city into a short-lived theocratic state. He organized the famous Bonfire of the Vanities, where his followers, caught in a frenzy of pious fervor, burned mirrors, cosmetics, fine dresses, playing cards, and even books and artworks he deemed immoral. This was rebellion not against a single rule, but against the entire Renaissance worldliness that had seeped into the Church. He challenged the Pope's authority directly, a breathtaking act of defiance that could only end one way. Excommunicated and abandoned by his followers, Savonarola was finally arrested, tortured, condemned as a heretic, and burned at the very stake he had once used for objects. His legacy is deeply ambiguous, a demagogue to some, a prophet to others. He demonstrated the immense power of a single monastic voice to mobilize masses and challenge temporal power, but also the terrifying potential for spiritual rebellion to curdle into fanaticism and destruction. The true impact of these rebels, however, lies not in their own often tragic ends, but in the historical ripples they created. Abelard's methods of questioning and logical inquiry, though condemned in his lifetime, helped pave the way for scholasticism and the university culture that would eventually fuel the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. His emphasis on intent in ethics, explored in his own struggle between love and duty, subtly shifted theological debates for generations. Savonarola, though his republic fell, became a potent symbol for later reformers. Martin Luther himself studied the friar's writings and saw in his stand against papal corruption a precursor to his own Protestant Reformation. A century after Savonarola's death, his image was being reprinted and circulated by Protestants as an example of a true Christian martyred by a corrupt Rome. Their personal dramas, one of the heart and mind, the other of political spirit, transcended their origins to become powerful narratives that others could adopt and adapt for their own revolutions. These figures force us to reconsider the very nature of the monastery's silence. It was never an emptiness but a resonance chamber. Within those quiet walls, a thought could be nurtured, a grievance could fester, or a revolutionary idea could grow to its full potential, away from the distracting noise of the world. When it finally broke forth, it did so with a clarity and force that could echo across continents and centuries. The legacy of the monastic rebel is a testament to the fact that the most powerful challenges to any system often come from within, from those who know its secrets and its weaknesses best. They remind us that the quest for truth, whether through love, reason, or faith, is an unstoppable human force, and that sometimes the most devout life is the one brave enough to say no. For centuries, the stories of monastic life were shaped by the words of medieval chroniclers, often written by the abbots and priors themselves, presenting an idealized version of events designed to uphold the institution's reputation. But what if we could bypass these biased accounts and listen directly to the physical remains themselves? Modern archaeology has given us that exact ability, turning the soil of ancient cloisters into a startling new archive that tells a far more human and often more dramatic story. Through painstaking excavation and cutting-edge scientific analysis, we are now uncovering tangible proof of the secret struggles and personal rebellions that written records deliberately omitted or glossed over. Some of the most chilling discoveries come not from artifacts, but from the monks themselves. Bioarchaeology, the study of human remains, has revealed skeletons that tell a violent tale starkly at odds with the peaceful image of monastic life. At a Carmelite friary in England, analysis of skeletal remains showed several monks with significant blunt force trauma to the skull, injuries that had healed years before their deaths. This wasn't evidence of a single brawl. It pointed to a culture where physical violence among the brethren was a recurring feature, perhaps as punishment or the result of explosive tensions that could no longer be contained by the rule. In other cases, bodies have been found in unusual locations, buried face down, or outside consecrated ground within the precincts, a practice often reserved for suicides or excommunicants. These clandestine, disrespectful burials suggest that some monks met ends so scandalous or tragic that the community felt the need to hide them literally in the dirt, forever silencing them in death as they may have been in life. The uncovering of forbidden personal possessions paints a vivid picture of the small, private rebellions that defined daily existence. While the rule demanded that monks own nothing personally, excavations routinely turn up items that speak to a need for individuality and comfort. Gaming pieces and dice carved from bone or wood are common finds. These weren't just idle toys, they were tools for gambling, an activity strictly forbidden as it could lead to greed and discord. The presence of these items in dormitories or private cells suggests covert games played by candlelight, a risky diversion from the endless cycle of prayer. Even more telling are discoveries of jewelry, simple rings, engraved medals, or pins, items with no liturgical purpose that were likely hidden keepsakes from a previous life or tokens of a forbidden affection. Each one of these objects is a silent testament to an individual who carved out a small pocket of personal identity in a world designed to erase it. Perhaps no sight better illustrates the tension between communal ideal and individual reality than Mount Grace Priory in Yorkshire, the best-preserved Carthusian monastery in England. The Carthusians were the most austere and silent of all orders, their lives dedicated to utter solitude. Each monk was supposed to live in a small, Spartan cell, alone with God, emerging only for church services. For centuries, we imagined these cells as bare, prison-like rooms, but archaeology has completely rewritten this story. Excavations of the individual cell complexes at Mount Grace revealed something astonishing. Each one was not a mere room, but a private two-story apartment with a small study, a workroom, and its own private latrine. Most surprisingly, each cell had its own walled garden. This was not a life of mere subsistence, it was a life of curated, productive solitude. These monks weren't just praying in their cells, they were gardening, growing herbs, reading, and crafting in a space they could truly call their own. The evidence suggests they even personalized their living spaces. The discovery of different pottery styles and quality in different cells indicates that some monks had access to finer goods than others, perhaps through personal connections or outside gifts, flouting the ideal of uniform poverty. This archaeological evidence doesn't show a failure of the Carthusian ideal, but rather a deeply human adaptation of it. Even in the most extreme pursuit of isolation, the need for a personal domain, for a connection to nature, and for a small measure of comfortable individuality proved irresistible. These material clues, from broken bones to hidden dice and private gardens, force us to radically reconsider the people who lived behind the cloister walls. They were not a monolithic group of identical pious robots, but a collection of complex individuals, some devout, some disillusioned, some violent, and some simply homesick. Archaeology allows their secrets, carefully kept in life, to finally be told. It adds a gritty, tangible layer of truth to the polished written record, proving that the real drama of the monastery wasn't in the grand chronicles, but in the soil, the bones, and the small, cherished objects hidden away from the abbot's eye. Science has become our time machine, not to an idealized past, but to the real, complicated, and utterly human world that silence could never fully conceal. Yet for all the internal rules and external pressures, the most enduring and damning portrayals of monastic life often came not from church decrees or chronicles, but from the razor-sharp pen of the satirist. Medieval literature, far from being solely pious, possessed a rich and biting tradition of mocking the very institutions that claimed spiritual superiority. This was not mere entertainment. It was a form of social commentary, a release valve for public frustration, and sometimes a safe conduit for internal dissent. The humor found in these works gives us a crucial window into how monasticism was truly perceived by the outside world, and even by those living within its walls. The most famous example is, of course, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Written in the late 14th century, this collection of stories features a gallery of religious figures who are almost universally flawed. There's the monk, a man who cares more for hunting and fine horses than for prayer or study. He is plump, well-dressed, and openly dismissive of the old monastic rules, considering them outdated and unnecessary. Then there's the friar, a charismatic but deeply corrupt figure who hears confessions for a price and is more familiar with the taverns and barmaids of the town than with his chapel. Chaucer's genius lies in his subtlety. He doesn't scream his accusations. He simply describes these men in all their worldly glory, allowing their own words and actions to condemn them. The portrait is so vivid and so human that it resonates because it feels true, confirming the public's sneaking suspicion that many who wore the robe were more devoted to comfort and privilege than to God. But Chaucer was far from alone. A whole genre of medieval poetry, known as Goliadic verse, was dedicated to this kind of subversive satire. Often written by wandering scholars or disaffected clerics, these Latin poems celebrated wine, women, and song while mercilessly lampooning the church hierarchy. They depicted bishops as gluttons, cardinals as fools, and abbots as greedy landlords more concerned with collecting rent than saving souls. The power of this satire was its accessibility. While the common person might not understand theological debates, everyone could understand a joke about a fat priest falling off his horse or a drunk monk snoring through Mass. This humor circulated in taverns and market squares, shaping public opinion and eroding the aura of untouchable sanctity that the Church worked so hard to maintain. Perhaps the most fascinating layer of this satire, however, came from within the cloister itself. Some of the most pointed and knowing critiques were penned by monks. For a brother chafing under a tyrannical abbot or disgusted by the materialism of his house, writing a satirical poem or a mocking short story was a relatively safe way to vent his frustrations. He could share it with a trusted few who would understand the specific inside jokes and references, creating a bond of shared dissent without ever openly challenging authority. The anonymity of the text protected him, while the act of writing it provided a psychological release. It was a way to reclaim a sense of power and integrity in a system that might have felt deeply corrupt. This internal satire functioned as a critical pressure valve, allowing resentment to be channeled into laughter rather than boiling over into open revolt. The ultimate effect of this literary mockery was profound. It served as a form of social control, holding a mirror up to the monastic establishment and daring it to recognize its own hypocrisy. While it rarely led to immediate reform, it undoubtedly shaped the broader cultural environment. It made the flaws of the clergy a topic of acceptable public discussion and likely made church leaders more sensitive to the potential for scandal. The laughter echoing from the pages of Chaucer and the Goliathtic poets was a potent weapon. It couldn't tear down stone walls, but it could certainly tarnish a reputation, and in a world where influence depended on moral authority, that was a force to be reckoned with. Humor became the people's theology, a cheeky and enduring testament to the fact that no amount of incense and Latin chant could see completely Chinese letter, the all-too-human failings of those who claimed to be closest to heaven. Yet even these most austere and rigid of orders were not frozen in time, immune to the very human dramas that shaped the broader monastic world. The silent orders, particularly the Carthusians and Trappists, did not emerge fully formed as perfect, conflict-free havens. Their famed strictness was often a direct response to the corruption and complacency they witnessed in other communities. Their evolution was a process of continuous adaptation, a centuries-long effort to build a structure so robust that human weakness could not so easily undermine it. They learned from the failures of others, tightening their rules around silence, solitude, and poverty to close the loopholes where ambition and desire had previously crept in. The Carthusian charter house, with its unique design of individual cells opening onto a cloister, was an architectural solution to a spiritual problem. It created a community of hermits, offering the solitude of the desert within a supportive framework. This wasn't just about enforcing quiet. It was about designing an entire way of life that preemptively minimized the sources of tension, from the elimination of personal property to the strict regulation of all communication. Their structure was their defense mechanism, a fortress of rules built to protect the individual spirit from both external distraction and internal decay. The true legacy of these orders, then, is far more profound than their famous vow of silence. It is a breathtaking testament to human resilience and adaptability within the most extreme constraints imaginable. For centuries, they have demonstrated that it is possible to forge a meaningful, fulfilling existence not in spite of limitation, but because of it. By systematically removing the noise of the world, the endless choices, the social competition, the material clutter, they created a space for a different kind of human richness to flourish, a deep, uninterrupted interior life. The drama within these orders shifted from the external power struggles of medieval abbeys to the internal, spiritual combat of a single soul alone in its cell, facing its own doubts, fears, and aspirations in the relentless quiet. This was the drama of the human spirit wrestling with itself and with the divine in the most intimate arena possible. And against all odds, this ancient way of life persists into the modern world. Today, Carthusian and Trappist monasteries still exist, not as mere museum pieces, but as living, breathing communities. they have not remained entirely unchanged by the centuries. The Trappists, for instance, famously support themselves through artisanal industries brewing beer, making cheese, crafting chocolate, that connect them to the modern economy while adhering to their principle of self-sufficiency. They might use the internet to manage orders for their products, a careful negotiation with technology that would have been unthinkable to their founders. This balancing act between tradition and modernity is a new kind of drama for them. How do you maintain a life of silence and separation in a world of constant digital connection? How do you attract new vocations in an age that prioritizes individual expression over communal obedience? Their very survival is a testament to their ability to adapt their practices without sacrificing their core identity, proving that their rules are not a brittle set of ancient laws, but a living tradition capable of meeting new challenges. This long view of history allows us to see monastic drama in a completely new light. The conflicts, the rebellions, the failures, they were not a sign of the system's impending collapse. They were the very engine of its evolution. Each crisis, from the power struggles of the Cluniacs to the reforms of the Cistercians and the strictness of the Carthusians, forced a re-examination of purpose and practice. Drama was the feedback loop that pushed monasticism to constantly refine itself, to become more resilient, more intentional, and more understanding of the human condition it sought to elevate. The silent orders represent one of the most refined outcomes of that centuries-long process. Their enduring presence reminds us that the struggles of the past were not wasted. They were the hard-won lessons that informed the practices of the present. The unbroken silence of a Carthusian monastery today is not an emptiness. It is a silence that has been earned, a quiet that contains within it the echoes of every argument, every reform, and every heartache that shaped it. It is the sound of an institution that has learned, through painful experience, how to build a house where silence can truly be kept. And so, the grand irony of the medieval monastery is laid bare. These stone-walled communities, founded upon the most transcendent of ideals, a complete renunciation of the self and the world in pursuit of divine purity, were, in the end, populated not by angels but by humans. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience did not erase human nature. They simply forced it to find new, more creative, and often more intense forms of expression. The silence did not eliminate drama. It amplified its whispers, turning every glance, every stolen note, and every hidden thought into a potential act of rebellion or connection. The stories we've uncovered of ambitious abbots, star-crossed lovers, intellectual heretics, and desperate escapees are not footnotes to history, they are history. They remind us that our pursuit of the perfect, whether in faith, community, or ideology, is always, inevitably, filtered through our beautifully imperfect humanity. These tales from the cloister are far more than just fascinating relics of a distant past. They hold up a mirror to our own modern quests for meaning and belonging. We may not live in silent orders, but we all navigate the tensions between individual desire and group identity, between personal ambition and the common good, between the rules we're given and the truths we feel in our hearts. The monk struggling under a hypocritical abbot isn't so different from an employee chafing under corrupt corporate leadership. The nun preserving forbidden knowledge resonates with the whistleblower protecting a vital truth. The mystic seeking a direct connection to the divine reflects our own search for authenticity in a noisy, mediated world. Their struggles are our struggles, their flaws our flaws, their quiet courage a timeless inspiration. If this journey into the shadows of history has sparked your curiosity, we'd love to hear which story resonated with you the most. Was it the political intrigue, the forbidden romances, or the intellectual battles that captivated you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation. And if you're hungry for more untold stories from the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. We have so many more secrets to uncover together. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most profound truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen closely to the echoes.